Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. My name is Yasmeen Shorish, and I am the immediate past chair of the ACRL Research and Scholarly Environments Committee. I am joined by my colleague Nathan Hall, who is the current chair of the Research and Scholarly Environments Committee, and by Rebecca Kennison from KN Consulting and Nancy Maron of Blue Sky to Blueprint, who were the primary authors and consultants on this research agenda. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If I need to be louder, go ahead and type that into the chat box. What we'll be doing with today's session is spending about half our time going through the presentation we have for you today, but also leaving plenty of time for you all to ask us questions about the agenda or the research grant opportunities that we have. So at the end, we'll have that time for Q&A. So please do type your questions into the chat box. I'll be kind of moderating that and looking over everything and reading them out when we get to that section of the presentation. And as Gina said, please make sure that you have in your to field all panelists and attendees selected so that we can all see the questions. Without further ado, I'll get started. And Nathan is advancing our slides today, so I'll ask to move on to the next slide, which is an overview of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to give just a brief description of the charge of the committee. It's a very long committee name, so we call it RESEC for short, and how that led us into developing the research agenda and the work that Rebecca and Nancy did in that development, and then the key findings that came out of this report, and how we have some opportunities to actually enact the change that's proposed in the agenda. Moving on. So a little bit about the committee RESEC. This research agenda came out of the committee's recommendation. RESEC is a goal area committee. ACRL has 4 of these committees that support the strategic plan or the plan for excellence that ACRL has. One of these goals for ACRL is that the academic and research library workforce accelerates the transition to more open and equitable systems of scholarship. So the way that the committee tries to meet this goal, our particular objectives are to increase the ways that ACRL is an advocate and model for more representative and inclusive ways of knowing, that we increase ACRL's efforts to influence and advocate for more open and equitable dissemination policies and practices, and that we enhance members' capacity to address issues related to scholarly communication. And we have several examples of what that could include. It's not an exhaustive list. It's just to give you an idea around open access or digital scholarship, and power and privilege and knowledge creation systems. So these are the objectives of the committee that we do in all of our work. And again, all to support ACRL's plan for excellence and strategic plan. So what, I think we might have skipped a slide there, or not. That's okay. What we did is we, together in the committee, thought that there should be a new research agenda to address scholarly communication in the research environment, because the last time RESEC developed a research agenda was in 2007. So it's been about, over 10 years. Now, perhaps you are like me, and when I first heard the words research agenda, I actually did not understand what they meant, and so what that was actually supposed to accomplish. ACRL has produced research agendas across its goal area committees over the years. And what a research agenda does is it aims to identify promising practices and areas where further research is needed. So we wanted to take a broad view of scholarly communication and the research agenda, because it's a very broad area. And we developed this charge that ACRL wants help in identifying actionable steps that academic librarians can take to accelerate the transition to and build capacity for more open, inclusive, and equitable systems of scholarship. And we knew that we wanted this to be really designed around having a lot of community-based consultation. And we knew that in the work that gets done in scholarly communication, we don't often hear highly representative perspectives in agenda setting. So the committee knew that these were high priorities to us, and we put out a call for proposals for consultants or interested parties, whomever really, to be the researchers and authors for the research agenda. And I'm very thrilled to say that we got a great proposal from Nancy and Rebecca, and they are going to talk to you all about the work that they did in defining terms and finding out what the key areas needed to be for this research agenda. So I will turn it over to Rebecca to get that first part of this presentation started.
Thanks, Yasmeen. So with the mandate in front of us to engage the community, our work began. And we, first of all, the charge was to think about open, equitable, and inclusive. And so we spent quite a bit of time talking to people, doing a literature review, doing expert interviews, and so on, to try to unpack what open, equitable, and inclusive might mean. And these are all very broad and somewhat contested terms. So we came up with what open might mean in terms of removing barriers to access and encouraging use and reuse, and especially the tools of production. The equitable, referring to the systems and institutions and processes that give everyone what they need in order to successfully participate. And inclusive, referring to opportunities for greater participation and removing barriers that can hinder participation, and encouraging and welcoming people to participate, particularly those whose voices have been marginalized. So these were the working definitions that we used, and we got a lot of conversation in the focus groups that we did, in the survey that we undertook, to try to help to unpack what people mean by these things. So we're going to refer to open, equitable, and inclusive throughout this presentation. And the work involved, as Yasmeen already said, our charge was really to understand the landscape. So we did that by undertaking a literature review that looked at literally hundreds of articles, mostly book chapters and so on, to really understand what the conversation was around open, equitable, and inclusive systems. We interviewed experts with a focus on issues of inclusion. We conducted an online survey that generated 834 responses. So really great responses from the survey. We held 7 focus groups online. Many of them focused in particular on groups that traditionally haven't been part of the research agenda setting. So those from community colleges, from various libraries, librarians of color, and people who are really interested in disability and so on. So we really tried to get a number of people to give us some feedback. We also conducted in-person roundtables We had 3 discussion groups, one at the Library Publishing Forum, one at ALA a year ago, and at the JCLC meeting in 2018, which is the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color meeting that was held in Albuquerque last year. So we also, after we wrote a draft, got public feedback on the draft. Again, an enormously wonderful, rich conversation from the community. And then we finally refined the final version with the RESEC members themselves. And so our analysis, after we established a better understanding of what openness, equity, and inclusion were in conversation with the whole community, this then led us to, we tried to do a number of different ways of thinking about how to approach the question and the problem. We started off by thinking about looking at the full spectrum of the life cycle of intellectual work. So from the first idea that someone has of a project that they could do all the way through to production, and then finally to distribution and preservation. We struggled with that. For those of you who took the survey, you would have seen a lot of that thinking in the way that we constructed the survey, because we were thinking about the whole entire research life cycle and how to make that life cycle more open, equitable, and inclusive. What we decided to do instead, which many of you saw as we shifted to that, particularly if you were at JCLC, we shifted to thinking about how these were interrelated themes. So thinking about people and content and systems, with the understanding that those, again, interrelated is the important word there, that those are so incredibly integrated that we couldn't really tease them out, but we tried to at least have these buckets to really think about people and content and systems. So starting, next slide. So for the people section, what we were thinking about people, the obvious question that we needed to address was, can we make sure that we have the right people in the room, in the library, in the press, as authors, and so forth? Can we really think about who is involved within the system in order to make a more open, inclusive, and equitable system, with an understanding that the more people you have involved, the fairer and more equitable the system would be. Next slide. So we know that there were groups that are actively taking on this topic. So not just at the scholarly communication level or the library level, but also university level and and so the paper, the paper does nod to progress that are being made in each of these areas. But we're just going to give you a flavor of what we were looking at. And of course, the whole research agenda itself is available online for download, or if you want a hard copy, those just got printed and they look beautiful. Can say, we just got ours, just showed up here. Nathan was saying he just got his moments ago. So there's also that. So one approach that we did look at was improving representation within libraries as part of embracing diversity and inclusion. So this could take a variety of approaches, such as addressing workforce questions like, how successful are the library's efforts to improve retention rates? How well have programs like diversity fellowships worked over time? What other practices influence recruitment and especially retention? So hiring is one thing, but retaining people, what does that look like? And a second approach was to improve the, can you go back? Not quite ready yet. To really think about how to approach diversity in the notion of scholarly communication itself. So not just the workforce, but also What do we even mean by scholarly communication, and who's working in it? So we take the approach that really everyone works within scholarly communication, because the whole entire research life cycle, and if you work within an academic library of any size or kind, or whether that's at a community college or liberal arts college or research intensive university or teaching intensive university, that to a certain extent everybody works in scholarly communication, whether this is collection development or metadata services, information literacy or data curation or IT. And so we took a very broad and inclusive approach to what the workforce looks like. So one of the research projects, for example, that might look at this would be to map the scholarly communication network, either at one organization or across the landscape, to surface the range of roles that are actually involved in this work, whether or not you have the title of scholarly communication. Next slide. So the second bit on people that we looked at was improving the working lives of people who are engaged in scholarly communication. And as I said, we take a very expansive view of what scholarly communication is, and so the people who are working in it. So the collaboration economy, as we are phrasing it a bit, is really the darker side, is how much labor is unacknowledged or under-acknowledged, unpaid or underpaid, and what exactly this looks like in terms of creating incentives for participation and really understanding the costs of this under or unrecognized labor. So a sample research project might ask, what are the total costs of a digital project? And how do you capture those costs and the costs of all the roles and time required to create, say, an open source publishing project or whatever the case may be. So really understanding everything that goes into that would be a possible sample project. Understanding participation, also taking a look at what motivates people to act, to change or not, and solving this problem would be a service to those in scholarly communication who devote a lot of energy to effecting change. So what does that look like too? Next slide. And finally, we looked at under the people section. So we still are going to be dealing with content and with systems, but is increasing awareness, creating concerning creators' rights. And we're intentionally using the word creators rather than authors, because again, what we want is really to understand the work that everybody does in order to assist in and enable a more open, equitable, and inclusive scholarly communication environment. So under retaining rights, retaining authors' rights, of course, but also creators' rights, both in common outputs like research articles and books, but also where the ownership lines can be a little bit less clear, like in digital initiatives or the creation of data sets that might be very important in and of themselves, or that are not really part of how we think about rewarding the work that people have been doing. And we're also thinking, when we're thinking about open and inclusive, one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking to people about were the times when perhaps openness and knowledge sharing need to be intentionally limited. So this is a special case, you know, in the case of intellectual outputs where open isn't the desired way to be. And there are some cases like that. For example, when the creators of an idea or a performance or a work have a clear and specific definition of who that intended audience is, and no intention of sharing it further, such as religious ceremonies or oral histories. And so really respecting those limitations and what the community is thinking, and who they wish to include and who they wish not to include. So really respecting that. So a sample research project there might include a retrospective inventory and assessment of library materials, reviewing them to determine to what extent they adhere to the library's more recent understanding of ethical guidelines concerning privacy, for example. So this is kind of the people section, and I'll turn this over to Nancy now to take us in through content and systems.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I'm sure that those of you listening already get a sense that Rebecca was right to remind us that that's just the people section. And so there's a tremendous range and variety of the topics in here. And so I'll take this moment to also just say there are a lot of different ways to have a research agenda. Some can be really laser focused on answering a certain kind of question, but this breadth is very intentional because part of what we want to do is remind people that there's lots of different ways to solve a problem. And so for those of you who think that the set of answers you're looking for is best arrived by thinking about the people, we hope this gives you some points of entry. And then the two sections I'm going to talk about have to do with content and with systems. So we hope that there's something in here for everyone. So for content, an approach to openness, inclusion, and equity is also just to look at, let's look at all these outputs of scholarly work and to figure out if all of those outputs are actually reflecting the diversity we want to see. And that can be in terms of formats, it can be in terms of content, it can be in terms of authorship. And so if we don't see the diversity that we want to see, what kinds of solutions might help to rectify that? So next slide. So we have a couple of sub-themes in this idea. And the first is that we heard from a lot of respondents and participants that the basic requirements understood, implicit and explicit around tenure and promotion is a really powerful driving force or conserving force, and that those things really haven't changed. And so to think about what might free up some of the blockages, let's think about what counts. Let's rethink what counts. So one area of that is to zero in on addressing areas where there is implicit and explicit bias. So there have been scholars who have begun looking at how we can expose these biases when it comes to evaluating scholarship and recognizing what counts as scholarship and by whom. So one area has to do, for example, with the Global South, where systems of scholarship and the way people work at universities and publish work may look quite different from the way we do it here. So for example, a research project, if that were the question, might do something that sounds as straightforward as developing case studies or profiles of research and publishing practices. I felt like this was an idea that came up in a few different in-person meetings we had where people just said, we just don't know enough. There should be a resource to do that. So a research project could take that on. It could develop a catalog of strategies that libraries use when they are considering collection policy around work from the Global South. So that's what we mean when we say sample research project. There's a question, there's a problem, and what else do we need to know to help edge towards a solution? Creating metrics built on value is another area, and this has been a hot topic. And in fact, my colleague Rebecca is actually deeply involved in this right now herself, which is figuring out, are we measuring the right things, and what do we want to measure, and how do we measure them? So this notion of alt metrics has been around for a while. And I think people constantly are trying to invent and reinvent things, but these newer ideas are pretty exciting. This notion of humane metrics. I think the project itself is called Humetrics, if I've got it right, which is a Mellon-funded study to think about totally different measurements of quality, things like collegiality and openness and community when we're evaluating work. So a research question could address what are the outputs that we can be looking at, and also how do we actually figure out what the barriers are. If we've decided that there are new ways to measure things, what's really in our way for trying that out and taking that on. Oh, and I see Rebecca's put in the chat a link. Thank you, Rebecca. So next slide. Another area is to actually zero in and look at the collections themselves. I'm guessing a lot of the people on this call are, I don't know, at libraries. You have collections already, so it's not just a forward-looking collections question, it's what do we have right now? And ensuring the diversity is a very, it's a very huge, I was going to say a huge deal, which is not to be confused with a big deal. But it's because the collections were created many, many years ago, well before some of these discussions were taking place. So a sample project, for example, might explore how libraries are even defining diversity. If you were to take a look at existing collections, how are you evaluating them? We have to have some definitions, or at least your institution probably wants to have some definitions around that before it could even do that kind of an evaluation. So that's one area. Another has to do with copyright, which itself can be something that limits the creation and distribution of content. And so there are questions that we can be asking about how to enact effective strategy around copyright. So some of that might be looking again at best practice that's around right now. And it could also look at current practice. What, for example, are libraries doing today, or what are practitioners doing today who are creating, for example, things like open educational resources. So if you have folks looking at open textbooks, in what ways, for example, is fair use being implemented? What have challenges been that are around copyright and ownership? And what seems to work? Where is further work still needed? So those are a couple of areas around creating more representative collections. So next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, it may have gone up. I think I just am not seeing it. So someone let me know if there's a problem. I'll forward on. So the next category that we talked about has to do with systems, which can sound very abstract, but it's actually, it takes up a lot of excitement and attention lately. Because there are some of us who feel like there's a way to make the quickest change might just be to zero in on some of the big structures that underlie all of the things we're talking about, like creating and supporting and preserving the scholarly communications content we've been discussing. And so the way that argument goes is, if only we had a really great low-cost publishing platform that lowered barriers so people all over the world in any role could publish their work, wouldn't that be great? So that's one argument, right? And another is, what if financial systems were just better aligned to what the actual costs of producing this work are? If the costs were better in line with what we could do, we had funding coming in and to supporting the folks who want to do the work and share the work, that might help solve a good chunk of the problem. So you'll see solutions in this section of the report that involve both business model questions around finance and also around digital infrastructure. Next slide. So supporting tech infrastructure that is sustainable, I feel like the words in there, probably there's very little people, I feel like it's a bit of a word salad, but again, those are actually pretty important ideas. So next slide, we'll talk about a couple of ideas in this space. So the first, and I don't know if I may not have mentioned this, but so, you know, I'll step out of this discussion quickly also to point out that while we have these three big buckets, people, content, and systems, within that, what you're seeing with these accordion sections are that there are 9 subsections and 18 topics. So when we say there's a real variety, there's a real variety. We have plenty to choose from. So when we talk about determining the right scale and scope, we know that there's not one perfect size, but we think there are probably some factors that can help determine what scale is best supported, and that could be best supported in general, you know, community-wide or at a specific institution. So some specific questions to think about are, you know, how, even looking at an institution, how do institutions play in these projects? How can they participate in community projects? What things can they build on their own, and where are they better served by partnering? So there's a whole range of ways to think about what scale actually means, and it doesn't always have to be bigger, but it has to be the right fit. Another question is around managing research data. And we heard a lot of people mention in our meetings that there's a lot of interest still in the library space to understand a little bit more about where are there commonalities and where the differences really lie when it comes to the wide range of research data activities and outputs in particular. So where can we look for some ways to have shared services or shared solutions in a range of disciplines that can be tremendously broad? So next slide. Another approach is just creating systems that permit more access to more people. So one avenue for creating greater access is to focus on supporting those who actually are facing very specific obstacles, for example, disabilities. So facilitating access for those disabilities can involve libraries at all levels, looking first locally to determine how far they have to go from where they are. And it can also include community-wide solutions that involve working with vendors directly to encourage or compel, we should say, them to develop products and services that are compliant. Another direction that could further open up access is to take a more proactive approach to what it means to actually cultivate users or a base of users or a community of users. So designing systems that focus on users sounds obvious, but it's actually pretty exciting idea because it almost requires thinking a little bit more like some of the commercial players have done so well. But why should they be the only ones to have the fun? You know, beyond just making something open, to what extent can the library community borrow some of the tactics to deeply understand user needs in order to build products and services that are tremendously appealing to those who use them? So a sample project might include taking a look at how those in libraries or academia execute those kind of user-looking, user-facing strategies. There could be case studies about how the commercial entities are doing it. And again, this could be just great lessons to learn. Next slide. So building mission-aligned organizational and financial systems, again, coming back to a topic that frequently shows up in the news, it's been a constant theme over the last several years, continues to be important. And this has everything to do with, you know, the pricing and the business models and whether entities are doing, you know, developing different strategies for providing open access in the various flavors it comes in. So that's still a tremendous area of importance, and there's plenty more to do there. One of the flavors of that is actually explicitly community-owned infrastructure. And I'll highlight that just because I know that there are several initiatives underway that are quite exciting. Spark has taken a role thinking about this. There's a team that Mellon is funding also to dig into this. And the question is, to what extent can the community come together and have community, meaning, you know, collection of academic libraries in this case, to take, again, a very proactive role in either owning, managing, maintaining the very infrastructure it needs most. So there's a whole host of questions around that these teams are taking on. You know, what financial models might work, but also, again, what elements of the infrastructure do we take on first? And again, are we talking about owning it, building it, maintaining it, buying it, acquiring it? So there's a ton of questions around there that involve learning more about the landscape and learning and developing a view of the finances. And finally, and I'll wrap it up here, kind of for any of these things to happen, there's a space of innovation that everyone feels so strongly about and wants to engage in, and it's hard, because we know it's hard because libraries are big organizations already and have a lot of regular things to do. But there's almost certainly a chunk of interesting research that could be done to understand what kind of sources in libraries can fund this space for innovation, and by space meaning time, people's time, and you know, and opening up to a little experimentation without too much risk. And then once you've done this, what are the tactics for evaluating the success of those initiatives and knowing which ones were just nice experiments and which ones should go forward? And so I'll leave things there. Thank you very much. I hope you guys have heard some ideas that kind of have excited your thirst for digging in and taking on a chunk of the research agenda. And I'll send it, I think, to Nathan now.
Yes, thank you. So how do we intend to move this forward? In order to advance the research agenda, ACRL is offering research grants to support projects that align with the research agenda's goals and values. The total pool is $30,000, which will fund projects up to $5,000 each. And proposals are due September 30th, and award notifications will go out at, I think, the last Monday in November. The main criteria for eligibility are that one person on the project team must be a member of ACRL for the full duration of a funded project. One person on the proposal team must be a practicing librarian or information professional at an academic institution. And finally, the funds cannot be used for tuition expenses. And one of the goals of these criteria is to allow and encourage cross-pollination so that we can learn from other fields, and also to help advance ACRL's values in other fields and professions as well. And we don't have the link for it's kind of a long link for the call for proposals, but if you search for ACRL Scholarly Communication Research Grant, you'll find it, and I'm sure one of my colleagues will put it in the chat as well. So let's see, and then, oops, where's the, oh, okay, we have a lot of support in creating this research agenda from ACRL staff, and including especially Kara Malenfant, who's our staff liaison for the Research and Scholarly Environments Committee, and then also various production people, and Erin Nevius, Allison Payne, and I think I'm forgetting the graphic designer again. And then also Mary Ellen Davis, who the executive director of ACRL, who supported this agenda throughout its full life cycle. We want to acknowledge the various expert interviews that the experts who supported Nancy and Rebecca in the initial phases of the research agenda setting. The focus group participants, the library publishing forum session participants, participants at the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color, all of the commenters on the public draft, and everyone who participated in the survey, which all said and done, that's more than 1,000 people. And then we've had, I think, 3 different rounds of committee members on RESEC in the time that this has taken from the first, from the initial charge to now. So, and we're looking at 2 more years of continued work on this, working with the proposals and grants that come out of it. So there's been a huge amount of labor that's gone into this project. And there was another slide missing, but we just had a busy year disseminating these findings we presented this at ACRL, at Library Publishing Forum, at ALA Annual, at Electronic Publishing, and next, after this webinar, we've got one more session or a presentation at IFLA. And with that, I think we can open it up for questions, and thank you very much.
Great, thanks everyone. Please do type your questions into the chat box, and again, it'd be great if you had all panelists and attendees selected in your To drop-down menu, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have about the agenda itself, the process, or the research grants, or the work of the committee.
I guess we were crystalline. No questions?
We're giving people time to type.
This is Nancy. I have just a prompt in case it encourages people. You may have noticed, like, some of the questions they're aimed at all different ways to engage, not just in different topics, but it's, it's in a piece of a different topic. And so I think one of the things that the committee was looking for is not necessarily to have people who regularly always do research projects, but really have anyone who who's working in a library setting, in a member institution, dig in. So we hope this encourages a range of participation.
Thanks, Nancy. We do have a question about requiring ACRL membership for grant applicants, perpetuating the problem of excluding many people who have traditionally been excluded from these kind of opportunities, especially early career and minority applicants, or those at institutions that don't have support for professional development. Why not make a free membership part of the grant award? So we did try to find balance with the requirements, and that was one of our approaches to make a member of the application team an ACRL member and not the PI, or not, something more restrictive in that sense. I think that we really struggled a bit. Nathan, chime in if you have a different perspective, but a little bit with how to find this balance of is a membership association, and we want to find honor the people who are members of the association, and that there are benefits to that relationship, but also not make it so restrictive that it is exclusionary and exclusive to people.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was going to say, the suggestion of membership as part of the grant award is actually really interesting, and I personally did not think of it. I think it's compelling.
I think we did go back and forth, the committee and the research team and ACRL, about how to make this as inclusive as possible. And it did. So from one end, it was, that all members of the proposal team should be members of ACRL, and then on the other end, it was like, well, how about no one be members? And I think the free membership as a part of the grant award is a compelling idea for me. I think from ACRL's perspective, it's a nonprofit organization, and it depends on membership fees. So they often use that as an incentive, or you include membership as a criteria in other grant awards. So we're not. We're kind of being a bit more expansive and open by making it just one person had to be included, and thereby also encouraging the proposals to be collaborative. So that was, I hope that answers your question, John, and I do appreciate it, and thank you for calling that out, because that was a kind of an interesting part of the process.
We also have a question asking about barriers of language and translation identified or discussed. Noting that rich pockets of activity might not be known or understood due to just such barriers. And we do have, I'll let Nancy and Rebecca maybe want to go into more detail on this question, but certainly we did talk about linguistic inclusion.
Yeah, so we did acknowledge exactly what you're talking about there, Brian, in terms of the need for not just thinking about English and the primary, the primacy of place, and really thinking about and taking a look at restrictions that happen around language, particularly not just in dealing with the people interactions, but also who gets left out in a primary English-driven academy. So we really, we do address that within the research agenda. It's a really important and area that could use a lot more research, taking a look at even things like metadata construction and discovery and discovery layers and so on as well. So really interesting. I don't know, Nancy, if you want to say something else on that.
No, it's okay. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca. Paige asks, says the report welcomes participatory research methods. Can you recommend any guides on conducting community-based participatory research?
This is Nathan. I have a methodology book on this in my office, which is not where I am right now. But I will send you a, well, it's public information. This is all librarians attending. I'll put my email in the chat and you can ask me that, and I will send you some citations in the next week when I'm back in the office.
I think Rebecca, Nancy, and I think Kara might also have some additional pointers.
I actually wonder, I mean, I realize I have a different kind of flavor of the question. I wonder if we could, maybe we should just put together some materials, or at least have a place where we can each contribute, because we really don't limit, like, and I guess that's one approach, but I wonder if people are going to have a lot of questions about how to do research or how different kinds of research. So I wonder if we find a place to share some resources for folks, or some pointers.
We could put something on the website, the Scholarly Communication RESEC website, and Kara's also noting that there's some resources in the annotated.
Yeah, we can make some additions to the RESEC webpage. I think there's not quite a blogging mechanism, but we can put up some guides there.
Yep, and Kara's adding some additional stuff into the chat box as an FAQ for the grant call for proposals too. I think those are great suggestions. We have a question here. Does the agenda encourage working across industry lines? For example, academics working with publishers on these questions? And notes that there's a relatively new group called Coalition for Diversity, Inclusion, and Scholarly Communications. Yes, that was founded by 10 trade and professional associations, and that the web link is in the chat box also. So I would say that the agenda does encourage working across many lines. The questions that are posed in that agenda, I think some of them would be difficult to really be comprehensive about without having some collaboration or research across lines or disciplines. You have to forgive Nathan lost his Zoom connection. So that's why the screen changed for you all there. Nancy, Rebecca, did you want to add into that based off your research?
I mean, I always think that there's no rule about who you should or shouldn't talk to. I think it has to do with what your aims are, right? So in this case, reaching across to work with publishers, it feels like a very natural thing to do for a lot of these questions. And I think I may have mentioned earlier in the presentation, there might be times where, whether you're partnering with or just studying things that look very different, they could look like full-on for-profit commercial solutions. It might be an important piece of research because it helps you understand something that reflects, that can be used in your environment. So I'd let the questions kind of drive who you end up partnering with.
I'm just going to copy some things that were put in the chat just to the panelists. I'm going to, this was from Christine Turner about the Educopia Community Cultivation Field Guide. I'm just copying some things over into the attendee chat box. And if people have additional questions, we have some time left for that.
I mean, just also, Yasmeen, just while we still have folks on the line, I would say I think one of the potentially really exciting things, almost as much as any specific research question someone might take on, is kind of what we're seeing going on in the chat right now, which is people coming together, sharing current thinking, sharing pointers to other things. I think that actually is going to be a very valuable byproduct of this agenda. So the more kind of sharing of the questions that are most important to you and how you choose to take them on within this community of several hundred people that were on the call today, I think is going to be great, very powerful.
Agreed. And I just want to call attention to the chat box again, that if you scroll up a bit, Kara did put the call for proposals to the grants in the chat box. You can go directly to that link if you want to see the criteria in more detail. But I will say, as I think I almost had a sort of mantra or motto while I was chair of this committee. It's like, this cannot be a document that just sits and is read once and put on a shelf or sits on a desktop or something like that. It has to be, and we say it in the conclusion, a call to action. And so we really want to encourage the community to envision that action in whatever way is most appropriate and impactful for that community. How many more years do we anticipate awarding the research grants? So I think that's something that is going to be determined a bit by how the first round goes. I know that we've been modeling a lot of this off of some of how the grants were disseminated from the Value of Academic Libraries Committee and the work that they did. And I think they're in a multi-year granting state. So we can't say, oh, we're definitely going to do it for 5 more years or 2 more years. But I think it is something that we're not looking at as it's just this one time that we're doing this. Assuming, you know, funds are available. Probably should use that disclaimer for ACRL's sake. I think one thing that we were also very cognizant about is this idea of doing research and what does research look like, and what is legitimate research. You know, the call for proposals has some guidance there in how you articulate your research design. But I do think that the idea or the intention of the committee and in talking with ACRL is that we are very, that we try to be true to the agenda, right? And that means that we're looking expansively at how people are approaching a problem or approaching a question, and to think really holistically about what that could look like. So I would encourage those of you who are looking at this and trying to think, well, I have this idea of engaging, but I don't know that this is like something you would read out of a textbook for a research method. You know, let the call for proposals guide you in sort of how you design that line of inquiry. And hopefully that will be less potentially daunting for some of us. Question, have you seen much research on librarian, especially ScholarComm librarians, involvement in discussion about promotion and tenure criteria on the campuses, reviewing or providing feedback on things like open access, digital scholarship, or scholarly impact metrics? Rebecca and Nancy, do you want to take first response?
So there's been some work done, not necessarily by ScholarComm librarians, but there has been some work on promotion and tenure and reviewing open access, digital scholarship, impact metrics and so on. But it's an area that's very rich in needing a lot more research in order to begin to address even what might change, how could things change, who are doing things to already enact change. So it's a really rich area. There's not a lot of work that's been done on this, at least as far as I know. So it'd be really great to see some people. Yeah, ScholarComm lab at Simon Fraser doing some work, but it's not specifically looking at scholarly communication librarians' involvement. I don't know anybody who's looked at it from that angle.
And I would say that there's some of the work that universities have done to explicitly acknowledge open access publications in their P&T criteria, that those have involved advisement or engagement in some way from the libraries. I think it's a very rich area for engagement, and libraries and scholarly communication librarians, if those exist at an institution, to provide that sort of expert analysis and expert advisement to the campus and to departments. Thank you for that question. And the agenda does get to the area of promotion and tenure and review, and that in a few different areas, not just in the counts section.
Yeah, and there's also, I'm trying to remember the final form it took, but there's a lot of back matter here in the report itself. So not only does every section have a bunch of suggested questions and models for research, but it also involves a lot of references for further reading.
And with that, we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to learn more about this report and the opportunities for engagement. We really hope that you all see yourselves in your work and your institutions reflected in this document and can go forward and do amazing things with it. Any questions, you can contact any one of us, and we really appreciate it.